Good evening and hello. Guten Abend an alle Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer. We are very delighted to host tonight a webinar featuring Professor Rockström from Potsdam Institute for Climate, Tobias Lung from the European Environmental Agency, and Andreas Hauser from the Swiss Environmental Agency. And I would like to give over to our host Sven Giegold very shortly, who will explain to all the participants how this webinar will be run and what possibilities are there to participate, to pose questions, to have the word also. Please, Sven, thanks for giving us this opportunity, and go ahead.
Well, very briefly, so it's really great to have so distinguished guests and such a wonderful colleague in Jutta, Paulus, to co-organize this. The question, of course, today is of utmost importance. Where's our environmental space? For us as Europeans, as part of a wider global community, and I'm really even a bit excited to have Professor Rockström here, who has developed the concept of the planetary boundaries we are now talking about so much in on different levels, in NGOs, in civil society, in politics, in science. So this is really exciting. But of course, the question is equally relevant. What does this mean for us in Europe? So it's great that the environmental agency, the European environmental agencies, and the contact person for your agency is actually Jutta, Paulus, has tried to adapt that or calculate this space, at least in some of the dimensions, to the EU. So this is so important because obviously we have to consider carefully how we could transform our way of doing business, our way of how to consume to that environmental space, which we share in most of these dimensions, of course, in the end, globally. Ja, es gibt aber auch eine deutsche Übersetzung. Alle, die jetzt geschockt sind, dass hier so viel Englisch gesprochen wird, unter dem Chat findet ihr einen Link und unter diesem Link gibt es dann eine Übersetzung schriftlich ins Deutsche. Ganz herzlichen Dank an die ÜbersetzerInnen, sodass auch alle, die mit dem Englischen und noch zudem dem Wissenschaftschinesisch im Englischen nicht so gut klarkommen, da wird euch geholfen. So, beyond that, this is really a space first of learning, but then of exchange. And this means that you can raise your hand using the hand function, but also pose your written question, either in German or in English. And Jutta, who will facilitate the whole event, will try to bring some order into it. We had 1,000 registered participants. This means impossibly everybody, not all of you can ask a question, but we will do our best to answer what you are putting forward. So without further ado, please stay tuned to our series of Green European webinars and Europe Calling. We are doing this regularly. We try to keep in touch with citizens, European politics, clever people to talk to, plus citizens. This is what Europe is all about, and our webinar series has already been successful doing this with more than 20,000 participants. So please, Jutta, take over. I'm now in listening mode. Hear you in the end.
Thank you, Sven, for explaining. I guess you have a bit of routine in this, having hosted so many webinars already. And I would just very, very briefly speak about this concept of planetary boundaries. Of course, we will hear about it in detail from our high-level speakers, but I first more or less stumbled across this concept in, I think it was 2011. The first publishing of the concept of planetary boundaries was in 2009, when Professor Rockström was still at the Stockholm Resilience Institute, and he gathered all the high-level scientists from different fields, not only climate change, but also biodiversity, also geologists, also people who are doing ocean studies. And they said, well, we have all this great science out there, but what does it really mean for humanity? What does it mean for civilization? So they decided to put together all their different results, trying to define a safe space for humanity and civilization to thrive on this planet. And by putting this together, they succeeded in defining a sort of limits, you know, like limits that that we have on air pollution or on water pollution, but limits for these planetary boundaries, which Professor Rockström surely will explain in a minute. And in the first publication of 2009, we had also Will Steffen from Australia, who is very famous for doing so many YouTubes about climate change. So I might promote these YouTubes here because they are very striking, and you really get a good notion on where we stand on climate change. And I found it very interesting then that at the update of the planetary boundaries concept in 2015, we really had also not only everything getting worse, but also having progress, because the ozone layer was still very much at risk, but this situation has actually improved. And that is due to the Montreal Protocol, of course, where the hydrofluorocarbons were limited. And I think this is a very important example showing that politics can help, that policy can actually have an impact, because the ozone layer is regenerating at the moment. And that situation was very much worse 20 years ago. So if politics listens to science, if politics acts according to the scientific results and the scientific input that we have, then we actually can improve our situation. And I think this is high time now that we really act on the climate change crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and also on the biogeochemical flows. I would like to elaborate just a little bit. We had this very important report from the European Environmental Agency, which looked at the impact that Europe has on the planetary boundaries. Of course, you had to focus. You couldn't cover all planetary boundaries, all the more as we don't have limits on each of the boundaries yet. But I found it very interesting that not only by what we do at home, so to speak, in Europe, but also what we do worldwide, how we do how our economy is linked to other economies worldwide, we do have a very large impact on the global planetary limits already, and we have to act very quickly in order to prevent a breakdown in several of those planetary boundaries, which might endanger even civilization of humanity on Earth. To put it very briefly, because Sven has already said so much, Professor Rockström will start with his presentation, giving us the global view, sort of. Then we will turn to Tobias Lung, who is the expert from the European Environmental Agency, working on planetary boundaries, especially in what it means for Europe. And then we'll have Andreas Hauser from Switzerland, who will bring us down to the national scale, because of course it's not only important what we do internationally, but also what we do at home and how we can actually bring politics to work on the local level in order to not further breach those planetary boundaries. I feel very honored that those scientists have agreed to sharing their knowledge with our audience. Very glad. Thank you very much for sparing so much time. And please, Professor Rockström, we wanted to start with you now. Thank you very much for sparing your time. I'm sure you have a lot of on your agenda as director of the Potsdam Institute.
Thank you so much, Jutta, and thanks, Sven, and hello, everyone. This is a very important moment. I just want to check, Jutta, are you seeing my correct first slide on your screens? I take that as a yes. Thanks. So what I want to do over the next 20 minutes is to give you a scientific update on the frontier of the planetary boundary science. As Jutta says, we have published 2 iterations, and we're actually in the midst of doing what we call Planetary Boundaries 3.0. But I'd like to set this in the frame of the turbulent times we live in, and also share with you some thinking and ongoing initiatives on the transformations towards a safe and just future for humanity on Earth. How does the science of planetary boundaries connect to the pathways to solutions in the future? And of course, we have to start in the drama that we're sitting in right now. I'd just like to summarize very briefly that the COVID-19, I think we all share today, is not a black swan. It was a predicted, it was an expected outcome of the hyper-connected, unsustainable world of the Anthropocene. We have entered a whole new geological epoch where humanity is today the prime driving force of change at the planetary level, which was the absolute fundamental entry point towards doing what Jutta explained, namely gathering science to try and define a safe operating space on Earth. Because fundamentally, we are today hitting the ceiling of hardwired processes that regulates the state of the Earth system. We are at risk of destabilizing the state of the whole planet and thereby the life support systems to humanity. And when pandemics break out, or heat waves, or disease patterns, or other types of extreme events, they are reflections of that hyper-connected world. 1.5 years back, following on the planetary boundary science, we've been postulated that transgressing boundaries and moving beyond the 2 degrees Celsius global warming pattern, we are today at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, puts us at risk of triggering biosphere feedbacks that could gradually take us towards a slippery slope that can make us slide away from the state that can support humanity. This is why we have so much scientific justification today that we need for our own development at any scale, from communities to the global level, guardrails or boundaries or scientific targets to guide that development in both business, policy, and civil society in general. Now, this means that in conclusion, at the situation we are right as we speak, we have 3 interconnected crises, that the climate crisis interacts and is dependent on the health crisis we're in with the fundamental ecosystem crisis. Right at the heart of this, we have the planetary boundary framework. Now, 6 months before the COVID crisis, we had a gathering at the United Nations General Assembly with the heads of state dialogue for the first time, having the scientific community proposing, based on not only the planetary boundary science, but also the whole Anthropocene observations around the world and the whole tipping elements research, that we may be forced to put on the table the need to consider declaring a state of planetary emergency. I just want to share with you that this was coming out of 30 years of advancements and all the exponential increases of pressures from humanity on the planet, coming to the conclusion that we now have a point of emergency which calls for a broad transformation. So you can see the lines of science adding up to a point where we are right now is indeed a transformative moment. Let me now share you the 3 pieces of lines of science that took us to the planetary boundary framework. The first, which I already referred to, is that we can today, from the scientific community, welcome humanity to the Anthropocene. And as I'm sure that you all know, this is based not on theory, but on observations, the hockey sticks of increased change over the past 150 years. You've probably seen these great acceleration graphs from 1750 and the onset of the Industrial Revolution till today, and how they all bend in the mid-1950s when we put in the high gear of the industrial metabolism. 1950s has now been postulated clearly as the onset of the Anthropocene. The second insight is the big question of what is the desired state of the planet? What state of the planet do we depend on for our human well-being? I quite provocatively perhaps, but feel that we today have overwhelming scientific support to conclude that the Holocene, the last 12,000 years since we left the last ice age, the geological epoch we learned in school to call the Holocene, is that state. It is our Garden of Eden. We have so much evidence on this today. This is one of these graphs of ice core data over the past 20,000 years. You have on the y-axis mean temperature deviation from the pre-industrial average, which is the 0 line. At -4 degrees Celsius, we are in deep ice age. We leave this ice age, start doing it 20,000 years ago, but then we enter the Holocene stability of the last 12,000 years. As you can see, this remarkable band of ±1 degree Celsius mean global temperature, and then we deviate off with a great acceleration into the point where we are today. This is indeed a remarkable period where we can today conclude that it's the only state of the planet we know for certain can support humanity. Now, these are the two fundamental insights. The third one is that if we are putting so much pressure on the planet, how does she respond? And the biogeophysical processes on Earth are increasingly understood. We understood and analyzed the Earth system more as a complex interconnected system with biomes and fundamental processes that keeps the planet intact. But we also learn increasingly that tipping points are an integral part of the functioning of the Earth system, that these are fundamentally part of regulating whether we are in a glacial state or an interglacial state. And as you may know, this has been advancing in a tremendous way over the last 10 years. This is the first tipping elements map published in 2008, led by Tim Lenton at Exeter University and John Schellenhuber, my predecessor at the Potsdam Institute, and colleagues around the world, identifying the big systems and processes on the planet that not only regulates the final state of the Earth system, but also having multiple stable equilibria, meaning that, for example, the Amazon rainforest, under too much pressure in terms of deforestation and global warming, can tip over irreversibly into a savanna state, shifting over and influencing water flows, nutrient flows, air quality, and of course, carbon feedbacks. We have an Earth system where we're starting to understand the landscape of these systems, from the monsoons to the ice sheets to the biosphere systems. Now, the update of this came out just a few months back, again, just before the Corona crisis, a publication that we did in the 10 years, so to say, anniversary of the tipping elements map in Nature, led again by Tim Lenton, showing quite dramatically that 9 out of the 15 known tipping elements on the planet are on the move, that we have scientific evidence that they are starting to behave in a more unstable way. This is, for example, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the big energy circulation in the North Atlantic that is slowing down, impacting on the monsoon system in the rainforest of the Amazon, which in turn has impacts on the southern oscillation and the ocean heat exchange, which in turn affects the speed by which the West Antarctic ice shelf is melting. This is the state of the science today, that the Earth system is a complex, interconnected system with tipping elements, with feedbacks that can cool and warm that are interconnected. That is the entry point to the planetary boundary science. Before then sharing the planetary boundary framework, let me just say that this is, I would argue, very well established today. This is a document that was presented at the United Nations General Assembly just a few months back, United in Science, which is a collaboration between the IPCC and the World Meteorological Organization and Future Earth. Now, what this shows in these red ember diagrams here are the summary of 30 years of scientific advancements in the IPCC reports. Each column here is an IPCC report, from the first report in 1990 to the 2015 1.5 degrees Celsius report. On the y-axis here, you have deviations from pre-industrial mean temperature. So you have global warming up to 6 degrees. Higher the red, the more risk of causing tipping points. The cluster to the left is threats to ecosystems. The cluster in the middle is triggering extreme events. The cluster to the right is the one that worries us most, triggering large-scale discontinuities or tipping points. If you back off from this screen, you see a pattern. You see that the risks are going down in temperature. And today, the dark red lies somewhere there between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius warming. What this tells us is that the more we learn, the more science advances, the more we have to conclude that the Earth system is fragile, that the risks are higher than we previously thought. We must admit that the more we learn, the more we have to recognize that precaution and staying within a safe operating space is fundamental. And this is from the IPCC assessments. You put all this together, we're welcoming to the Anthropocene. The Holocene is the only state we know that can support humanity. Tipping points are real, and that gives us the planetary boundary concept. It is relying or based on 2 questions. Well, it was published first time in 2009 and then the update in 2015. It is fundamentally about answering 2 questions. The first high-level question is, what are the processes on the Earth system that regulates the state of our planet? And the second question is, if we have the Holocene as a reference point of a desired state, what are the quantitative boundaries that can provide us a safe operating space? If we stay within them, we have a high chance of remaining in a Holocene-like state. We transgress them, we are at risk of pushing ourselves away from that state. That's the planetary boundary framework. It's as simple and basic as that in the search of those boundaries. The first analysis, as Jutta pointed out, came out in 2009, identifying 9 processes that, however we turned every stone across the whole Earth system sciences, we could only find these 9 systems. The green space here is the safe space, and we identified that on climate change, biodiversity loss, and interference with the global nitrogen cycle, we concluded in a danger zone. The 2015 update shown here, we actually advanced the whole concept quite significantly by adding a danger zone shown here yellow, which is the uncertainty range in science, recognizing that there is a complexity and an uncertainty that will always be challenging with as we learn more and more about the Earth system. But again, concluding, unfortunately, the 4 of the 9 boundaries are in either danger zone in yellow or in a high risk zone in red. It is biodiversity, it is interference with the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, it is land system change, predominantly forest degradation, and interference with the climate forcing. Now, these 9 boundaries, I won't go through them in detail. I was really encourage you to have a look at the publications here, but just to mention very briefly that in this 6-year period between the 2 first assessments, we had a very strong critical review from scientific colleagues around the world and verifying that these 9 systems are not questioned, but seem to be a good conclusion of the system that regulates the outcome of the state of the planet. They include the 3 big systems, the climate system, ocean stability, and stratospheric ozone layer that Jutta referred to earlier, but also the slow biosphere variables of biogeochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus, the global hydrological cycle, water, land system change, but finally also biodiversity, the whole living genetic diversity and the structure of ecosystems that regulates the ability to have biomass, water, air quality, etc. Now, there are also 2 boundaries that are what we could call the Earth aliens, chemical pollution and aerosol loading that are created by us humans loaded into the Earth system. These are the 9. We've been able to quantify 7 of them. Just to share with you that some of these boundaries have tipping points to the left, and it's easier to define the boundary position when you have evidence of nonlinear change. But a boundary can also have a kind of a softer trajectory, but still being a planetary boundary if they're connected to the systems with tipping points and thereby potentially undermining the state of those systems with tipping points. So for example, land system change may not necessarily have a planetary tipping point, But as you lose land and thereby lose carbon sinks, you erode the climate system, which has tipping points. So that's the connection between the different systems. We're today doing a lot of research on advancing the water planetary boundary to further detail. We're working a lot on interactions between boundaries, showing that the more we learn about interactions between climate, biosphere, nutrients, and water, the space may be reduced if we transgress one boundary and thereby having to pull back further on other boundaries. We have plenty of research today showing the importance of all boundaries, that even if they operate at the local level, how they cross scales. Water, of course, is a local entity sustaining all the ecological functions at local ecosystem level. But they also determine to a large extent the rainfall patterns at the large regional scale. The dark red regions here are regions that to 80% or more depend on rainfall generated by evaporation from upstream ecosystems, meaning that the water cycle upstream of the rainforest provides rainfall for southeast parts of Latin America. These are the kind of interconnections that makes water, even if it's a local entity, a planetary boundary. Look at this map on aerosols from NASA, showing the optical depth on planet Earth affected by air pollution across continents, which affects the stability of rainfall patterns in the monsoon systems, and that can also have and has feedback dynamics into the global mean temperature. So it's not surprising that what seems to be local environmental issues also have today global impacts and need to be considered as boundaries. The Planetary Boundary Framework is today injected into different science initiatives, such as in Future Earth and in the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, adopting the Planetary Boundary Framework in exploring sustainable pathways to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals within a stable planet. So we see connections in also a safe and just space and research development across the world. I just want to share with you one of the important deep scientific frontiers here, that the Anthropocene, the geological epoch that we've now entered, we're exiting the Holocene. Does that mean that we need to, so to say, consider a doomed future, that we've lost our ability to return to the Holocene? My conclusion is that the answer is no, because the Anthropocene is a pressure, but it's not yet a new state. And that we have more and more evidence that we are at risk, but that we can still turn back. This is a remarkable graph by Burke et al. Showing the last 60 million years on Earth, and it's again temperature variability on the y-axis. And what you see here in yellow is the Garden of Eden, the 10,000 years of the Holocene, our desired state. But then you have the jumps up and down from glacial into glacials 1 million years back, and then you have all the way to 60 million years back of temperature deviation. We are, as you know today, moving along a trajectory that can take us to up to 4 degrees Celsius warming by the end of this century. That's the line you see coming up on the right-hand side. What would that mean if we would follow that pathway to the future? Well, it would actually suggest that we are winding back the climate clock all the way back to the Miocene or the Pliocene, some 5 to 10 million years back, just to show how the transgression of boundaries is really about rocking over the whole logic in our planetary system. Now, we have at the Potsdam Institute quite recently done a deepening modeling run along these lines. To me, this is one of the most humbling graphs we have today, published just in 2019. For the first time, a model is physically calibrated to the functioning of the Earth system and run over the past 3 million years. That's the x-axis here. And again, deviation from mean temperature on the y-axis. And what this shows in green is that the global mean temperature over the last 3 million years has most likely not deviated above 2 degrees Celsius. And that we there have this self-regulating Earth system, forced from external forcing, but having biosphere feedbacks of the planetary boundaries, keeping the system within this range, and that we're now pushing ourselves beyond it. So this is just to give you even more scientific support for the need of a planetary boundary framework. Then let me just close with a few remarks on the pathways forward. It is all about prosperity and equity within planetary boundaries. First, we need to just conclude with this brilliant work from O'Neill et al. At Leeds University that we are in a difficult situation. This is the first time countries in the world are mapped against, on the x-axis, transgression of boundaries. So the further to the right you go, the larger number of boundaries you've transgressed. The y-axis is accomplishing social indicators that we all aspire to. GDP growth, life satisfaction, nutrition, good education. So the higher up on the y-axis, the better you're doing on the SDGs. And here we are. This is the European Union. Here you have the rich OECD countries in the world. We are delivering well on social indicators at the expense of the planet. Nobody is here. Nobody is in the desired corner of delivering human well-being, really good lives within planetary boundaries. So the challenge is still there. We're still not deviating or transforming in the future we want. We took this to the food system in the Atlantic Commission, trying to explore how to transform the food system within a planetary boundary framework. The first time health and sustainability was integrated in one analysis, showing that we can actually feed humanity within planetary boundaries. But this is where we are today. We're transgressing climate, biodiversity, land, fresh water, nutrients, food being the single largest cause for transgressing planetary boundaries. This is the first time the planetary boundaries is applied globally on one system, in this case, food. But we also showed that we can actually feed 10.2 billion people, the 2050 projected population, if we invest in sustainable agriculture and sustainable intensification system. So there are possibilities of producing food within safe operating space for humanity if we just load up and start scaling the knowledge systems that we have. We've seen similarly on the carbon law that if we want to now come back into safe operating space on climate, we need to bend the global curve of emissions no later than 2020. We may be actually paradoxically doing it this COVID-19 year, but then reach a zero carbon world economy by 2050. This is all about cutting emissions by half every decade, but it's also in green and blue, keeping the biosphere planetary boundaries intact so we can have the negative natural carbon sinks intact. That's why delivering Paris is a planetary boundary agenda. It's not enough to just get rid of fossil fuels in the energy system. We have to keep the resilience in the entire system intact. That's why we, together with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, identified 6 transformations, together with Jeff Sachs and colleagues, that are the possibilities for us to really come back into a safe operating space and deliver on the SDGs. And these are, you just look at them quickly, areas of innovation, of equity, and of prosperity in technology, in urban design, in food transitions, in decarbonizing. It's quite interesting that sustainability is now transitioning into being a pathway to deliver on the fundamental, let's say, good outcomes that we're searching for humanity. So the SDGs is the palette that guides us, but with the planetary boundary framing, they have to be put, or let's say designed from this smorgasbord into what I call the wedding cake, that there are among the SDGs the planetary boundaries, goals 6, 13, 14, 15, water, climate, biodiversity, and oceans are firmly there. They're non-negotiable, and we have to put the social and economic goals inside there. And I would argue that the European Union with the Green Deal is as the first region in the world showing that direction. It has a lot about equity, as we know, with the Cape Raworth safe and just space. This is an ethical dimension that has to be addressed very, very operationally. We're now, to just give you 2 hints of where we're heading, we're trying now with business and cities to define sustainable targets for a safe and just operating space, where the Earth Commission is established to define the safe and just space, feeding that into business and operationalizing it in cities. Quite an exciting bridge today between science, business, and communities. We're also working with the integrated assessment modeling community to explore transformation pathways towards a resilient, safe future that delivers the SDGs by 2030 within planetary boundaries by 2050. So I think we have to start really connecting these 2 concepts together: people's health planet's health, stability, and security. And that is kind of the fundamental last thing I'd like to leave you with. Why not put the Sustainable Development Goals inside the safe operating space of Planetary Boundaries as a guide to redefining sustainable development in the 21st century. Thank you very much, and back to you, Jutta.
Thank you so much, Professor Rockström. That was really a lot of information in a very short time frame, and well, I felt sort of thrown back because I had been listening to Kate Raworth, whom you surely know too, who invented sort of the donut economy, which is sort of a relative to your wedding cake economy, saying that we have to respect the planetary boundaries at the outside, but the societal boundaries at the inside in order to create a healthy society. And I'm really glad that scientists are speaking up more loudly, because coming from science a bit myself, of course not in the way that you're doing science on a very, very small level, but still I found it very, very interesting that when science tries to be very precise and very cautious in language, then people understand, well, they're not really sure of what they're talking of. And I think that's one of the problems when science says we have so much certainty on that. It really means, well, any person in a normal way would say we're certain. We don't have much doubt about it. But in scientific language, people tend to understand, well, they're still discussing, so we wait until they're 100% sure until we do something. But there is no such thing as 100% certainty. I mean, I've been working in quality assurance for quite a long time, so I know there's no such thing than as 100% correct data, because you will always have measurement uncertainties and things like that. I would just like to briefly bring in two more things. You were talking about the Atlantic Ocean circulation. For European listeners, this is the Gulf Stream. So when this is slowing down, we might even, within global warming, have a cooling effect in Europe, because the Gulf Stream, of course, is transporting warmth towards Europe, else we would have a climate similar to that in Canada. So this is one of the effects which is not observable to the eye from the very beginning. And the second remark I would like to make is on permafrost, because it has now been in media in the last days due to this terrible accident in Siberia, where we had thousands of liters of diesel oil running out of a damaged tank, and this is due to permafrost thawing, because the pillar where the tank was situated actually broke away because the soil was getting soft. And I think that's a danger which will occur even more in future, as permafrost is thawing even more quickly than everyone thought. So thank you very much, Professor Rockström. And to anyone wondering, this webinar is recorded, so everyone who wants to look at the slides for a longer time, you can just watch the webinar again as soon as we can upload it. And I'm sure that, no, I'm not sure, but I would ask whether it would be possible that you would share your presentation on our website so that people could have a look at it in detail. But now, as to lose not more time with me talking, I would like to give over to Tobias Lung. I'm happy to have you with us. You're the expert of the European Environmental Agency, and you were responsible for putting together this important report on Europe's role in transgressing the planetary boundaries. Thank you for being with us. Please start.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm excited and honored to be with you here and to be able to show some of the results of our work we've been doing on trying to make planetary boundaries work at the European scale, to apply them to the European scale. Essentially, what we've been trying to do is to combine planetary boundaries thinking with footprinting approaches. And this under the umbrella of the overarching grand question of whether we live actually within our limits of the planet or not. And this refers back actually to the 7th Environmental Action Program, which many of you might know. It has been the guiding document for environmental policy in Europe over the last 7 years, since 2013. And its vision is actually living well within the limits of our planet. So it has planetary boundaries thinking enshrined into its vision. And if you look deeper into the document, then you would see explicit calls for a better understanding and better knowledge on these types of questions. Now we all know that the policy setting at the European scale has changed. There is a new commission, but the focus on this type of knowledge has not changed at all. If we look at one of the first statements Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made about her priorities, then she said, Europe must lead the transition to a healthy planet, which is exactly the same thing. It is thriving, social well-being while respecting ecological limits. This has then translated, as we know, into the European Green Deal with a whole series of ambitious initiatives with, for example, the ambition of Europe being climate neutral by 2050, very ambitious targets on zero pollution, on clean energy, and so on. I will come back to some of these later on. So this is kind of the policy context within which we have tried to explore how we could bring the science behind planetary boundaries more into an application at the science policy interface. We have been doing this for the last 5 years, actually. We started in 2015, basically with the publication of the update by Sven et al. To frame the knowledge challenges. Then subsequently, we have done a big stock-taking exercise to gather up all what we know scientifically on boundaries, on the interlinkages. Professor Rockström has stressed that very much. There is an increasing understanding of how these things are interlinked and all the feedback loops and triggering mechanisms and so on. And then in the last number of years, we have done some calculations at the European level ourselves and an assessment. And the latter two activities have led to a report. We've just published some weeks ago this report, which has the same title as my presentation. And I'll share my presentation with you. So afterwards, you can have a look at the full version of the report or the summary brochure, which is a nice 10-15 page reading with nice visualizations that show the key results from what we've been doing. We've been doing this in collaboration with many partners. EU institutionally, we have worked with the so-called Environment Knowledge Community, which is an informal collaboration of different Commission DGs and the EA. We had a link to the international level through collaboration with UNEP Geneva, and we have closely worked with the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland, and my colleague Andreas Hauser will then go into the details of that in the last presentation. And then, of course, we've also worked with research with several institutes and universities and environmental organizations. The overarching framework for what we have been doing has been guided by 3 main questions, and that's basically a little bit the structure also I'd like to show you in the remainder of my presentation. We've been asking 3 questions. One is, how can we understand a safe operating space for Europe? How can we potentially define, calculate a safe operating space for Europe? And then the second question following from that is, how are we doing? What is our environmental footprint? How much pressure do we actually exert on the environment, both in Europe and in other parts of the world? And if we then compare questions A and B, we would be able to say something about whether we actually live within Europe's safe operating space or not. So let's look at these three questions a bit more in detail in the following. Well, as Professor Rockström has shown, the idea of a safe operating space and the planetary boundaries is a global concept. So if we wanted to get to grips with an understanding of what that means for Europe, we would need to calculate European shares. We would need to allocate specific shares of that for Europe. You could also frame it in a different way. You could say we would need to downscale planetary boundaries to the European scale. And that inevitably is a normative process. There are many, many ways to do this, and there is no right or wrong. It really depends on the perspective. And therefore, we have chosen an approach that looks at different allocation principles to calculate such shares, rather than just relying on an approach that has been done in many past studies that has taken population as basically a proxy to calculate a share of a certain region, of a certain country, and so on. So we've looked at 5 principles. Equality, which picks up on the population, which basically assumes that each human being on Earth has the same right to access to resources. Basically, yeah, that's the guiding principle of that principle. Another alternative is the needs principle, which the underlying rationale here is that different groups of society have different needs. Children have other needs than middle-aged people, yet older people have another set of needs. People living in rural areas have other needs than people living in the cities, and so on. Another perspective that you could have on this would be the right to development, and there the rationale is that already quite developed regions or countries should give space for developing countries to catch up economically. So in this case, Europe would have a rather low share, and you will see some calculated values in a minute. Sovereignty is the straight opposite. There, the starting point is economics, and the idea is basically that economy comes first, and everything is geared towards economic growth. And the fifth potential way of framing this would be looking at capability, and that could take the perspective of especially financial capabilities. So how much are we able to pay to mitigate environmental destruction? How much are we able to pay to mitigate climate change, even to restructure our economy towards a more sustainable modus operandi? So we've applied all these through a range, multiple calculation approaches, and then we have calculated some values for Europe. You can see them here, and as I said before, assuming a right to development approach that would lead to a low share, a strong economic perspective, because Europe has a strong economy, would lead to the highest share. And this is, in the first place, independent of any planetary boundary. And then we've applied that to different planetary boundaries in some exploration work, and I'll show you results of that in a minute. The second question then is, how are we doing actually? What is our impact? And here we've taken a consumption-based perspective. We have been using the latest state-of-the-art model to do that for Europe, developed through EU research money. And that looks into our impact both on our territory, but also the impact from European consumption abroad. And we have done that applied because it's an exploratory work, not to all boundaries, but to, strictly speaking, 3. We have divided the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle into 2 separate calculations. So in terms of calculations, we have 4, and then land system change and freshwater use. And as Professor Rockström has also emphasized very much, I would like to stress again how interconnected these are with core boundaries like biosphere integrity and climate. So if we fail to address sufficiently the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, land system change, and freshwater use will not be able to succeed with issues on biosphere integrity and on bending the curve on climate change, because these are ultimately strongly interconnected with lots of feedback loops and linkages. So these two steps we have done, and then we have run a series of calculations, which leads us to the core question: how are we doing in terms of staying within safe operating space? So let me walk you through this table that might seem a bit confusing at first glance, but it's rather easy to understand. These are the results of question 1 aggregated at the European level. We have calculated limits for all these 4 Earth system processes. Then, in the same way, we have calculated footprints for Europe, and then it only takes simple math to get an indication of how we are doing. And we can see that for nitrogen especially, but likewise also for phosphorus and for land system change, our results indicate that Europe overshot what we could define as European safe operating space. That's not the case for freshwater, but here we shouldn't forget that this is an aggregated figure at the European scale, and it disguises some regional issues, of course. We all know that, for example, in Southern Europe, there are severe issues with water scarcity, and they are even set to be aggravated because of climate change in the coming decades. So this is not reflected in these aggregated numbers. These give ballpark figures of the direction of travel we are on, and they are not good in most cases. Let's compare the results back to the 5 principles we have been using. So let's look at the performance, which you can see as the vertical dotted black line against the 5 principles of how you could approach a European safe operating space. And there, the conclusion is for nitrogen that regardless which perspective you take on defining a safe operating space for Europe, the results indicate that we are in the red zone of contributing to increasing global risk, actually. For phosphorus, the situation is similar, except that if you applied a very strong economically driven rationale, then you could argue that we may be in the zone of uncertainty. Zone of uncertainty in this study is defined as sort of the range of different calculation approaches that we have run for each of the 5 allocation principles. A similar situation as for phosphorus, we also see for land system change indications of transgression for 4 out of the 5. Only if we applied a very strong economic perspective, then we could argue we are still in a zone of uncertainty. For freshwater, we don't see any transgression at this aggregated European level. So what does that lead us to in terms of conclusions? Clearly, Europe faces key systemic challenges, and given the focus we have had, this is in particular for our type of work we've been doing with these 4 Earth system processes related to nutrient pollution, nitrogen, phosphorus, but also land system change. And our results indicate that the European footprint should be reduced by roughly a factor of 3 when it comes to nitrogen losses, and a factor of 2 when it comes to phosphorus and losses and land system change. And that means that we really need profound, deep transformations of our current systems of production and consumption, like the energy system, like the mobility system, and especially the food system. The food system is a key leverage point in the context of the boundaries we've analyzed here. Food directly relates to nutrient pollution. It directly relates to water, and it directly relates to land system change. And new ambitions under the European Green Deal provide actually an opportunity to deliver at the European territory. If we look at some of the targets and ambitions enshrined in these, we can see, for example, ambitions in the proposed climate law. We can see strong reduction targets for nutrient pollution in the recently published Farm to Fork strategy. Likewise, ambitious targets for reducing land take in the biodiversity strategy, and so on. So there is an opportunity here. In terms of knowledge, we think the study has made some important advances on operationalizing this concept actually at a subglobal scale, in this case Europe, especially by applying this approach of using a basket of different allocation principles instead of going for a rather simple per capita approach to define such a regional safe operating space. And also in linking planetary boundaries thinking with consumption-based footprinting approaches. And my colleague Andreas will tell you much more about the consumption-based footprinting approaches in his presentation that focuses on Switzerland, actually. Some critical knowledge gaps remain. Professor Rockström stressed that the understanding of global environmental limits is evolving, and that's very good. Also, when it comes to understanding feedback loops and linkages between global processes and regional processes, there's a lot we understand now that we didn't understand a very short while ago, as also illustrated by Professor Rockström. But there is a challenge of translating this to more applied studies that we've been doing. We also need to better understand differences between regions. There are huge heterogeneities across Europe, for example, when it comes to the underlying factors driving nutrient pollution, such as nitrogen, factors such as soil conditions, and so on and so forth. And then there is also an issue when it comes to footprinting approaches in terms of financing mechanisms. Financial investments are lacking, actually, and a huge increase actually is needed there to be able to update some of these approaches and expand existing models. For example, we wouldn't be able to a similar analysis on biodiversity simply because these footprinting approaches couldn't do it at this stage. And also, in some cases, we have issues with updates because much of these studies are financed as one-off projects, and then regular updates that we have with all sorts of other data is not ensured. So overall, and that's what I would like to end with, is that collaboration with science networks is essential at this to further advance this work at the science policy interface to bring planetary knowledge, planetary boundaries knowledge from the fundamental scientific findings into a more applied setting at the science policy interface. And with this, I'd like to hand back to you, Jutta.
Yes, thank you very much, Tobias, and thanks for showing that the EU has basically outsourced a lot of its environmental impact, and we knew that it had been outsourcing the societal impact for very long, taking advantage of low cost in other countries, but it's the environmental impact too. And thanks also for advocating for a fair distribution. I think it's very, very important that we advance on those indicators, as you just pointed out, not looking at a per capita base only. And just, if I may remark, if we would do the same thing on climate, then our carbon budget would be negative because we have such large historical emissions already. So if those were taken into account, then we would have to stop emitting right away and even suck a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere in order to have a fair distribution. I think this was a very, very comprehensible summary, especially with the visualizing. That was very helpful because if you read the report, it's the numbers are more difficult to understand than seeing them on such a red and green scale. That's really, really good. And it visualizes actually our place in the upper right corner of Professor Rockström's graph very, very well. And I think as the graph there was this little legend saying 2011, so I think 2020 may be even worse. I would like to make one additional comment on the nitrogen and phosphorus boundary. Of course, this is linked to our food system, and to get back within the boundary, to bring down the consumption of meat is paramount. And I think it's very unfortunate that the farm to fork strategy did not find strong words on this necessity, because already now at least in Germany, I think it's true for the whole European Union, we use more arable land to provide food for the animals which we eat than to provide food for humans per se. And if we count in the arable land which we use in Brasilia, Argentina, and elsewhere to feed our animals, that relation becomes even worse. So I think politics should be courageous, saying, well, you guys, we know meat is something great, but just halve your meat consumption, and then we can actually stay within the planetary boundaries much, much easier. And to come to the last slide that you showed, I think in the 27 years of its existence, the European Environmental Agency has built a real great network of scientists already, bringing together knowledge, collecting data, providing politics with evidence that we urgently need in order to make good legislative proposals. And I will stand up for a very robust financing of the environmental agency, because we have seen already that the budget for the European Union is at risk, so to speak. So of course everyone is looking at points where could we maybe save some money, but I think in our agency that provide us with the scientific knowledge, we must not make any cuts. On the contrary, for delivering on the Green Deal, we need them more urgently than ever. Thank you very much for your input. And now we come to Andreas, and I'm very curious about transforming the boundaries to the national scale. Go ahead, Andreas. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be on this panel. I don't know if you already see my slide.
Yes.
Okay, I don't see it anymore. Myself. Okay, now it's working. And as Tobias mentioned, the collaboration with Science Network is essential. I should add that collaboration with Tobias on this study that he has just presented was also very much inspiring. So, and I think Nicola from our international division would also confirm that. I'm an economist from the economics section of our office, and you might wonder why, as a Swiss guy, I'm presenting here on the European table. I have to tell you that Switzerland is a full member. Of course, we are not a full member of, or any member of the European Union, but we are a full member of the European Environment Agency. And I think that was a good decision. Switzerland has done footprint statistics for a long time. Starting with climate, but then expanding to others. And when we learned the Planetary Boundaries published, when we first saw these papers appearing from Johanna Rockström, we had great discussions, and we soon realized that this was like the missing link. And I want to tell you why. But let me start with some rating. This is a recent rating that has been published. Maybe you know this from the Bertelsmann Foundation. And this is a rating of all countries of the world, and when you look at it, you might think, okay, the European countries are doing quite well. Okay, of course the Nordic, and then also France, Austria, and Germany, and okay, Switzerland maybe a little bit below expectations, but still acceptable. So you could think, well, that must be enough. Maybe some countries have not the best marks in one discipline, but that can be easily compensated by better marks in other disciplines. But is that the whole story? I believe not. I believe that the boundaries that have been shown by Johann Rockström tell us a different story. Here you have the planetary boundaries on the outside, and you have on the inner circle also some social foundation. This is what Kate Raworth calls the donut economics. And there, the message is much different. It means that if you go outside these thresholds, that this is a no-go area, that this is risky zone. And that's a very much different message now. As long as you are on the donut, Johann Rockström called that the Garden of Eden. I'm not so sure, but I think it's a very nice place to be on the donut. But as long as you are on the donut, then you can say, okay, let people decide what they want, let the market decide where it wants to go, let governments also decide where they want to head to. But if you go beyond some thresholds of our planet or also on critical human needs, then we enter a zone of risk, and I think it is a bad idea to go there. I want to show you some consideration of footprints. Jutta, Paulus had also already mentioned that a big share of our environmental footprints is outside Europe, or in this case, where what you see here is outside Switzerland. Of course, this is even more the case for a small open economy like Switzerland. In the middle here, you see the greenhouse gas footprint with rising share of footprint abroad. On the right hand, you see a biodiversity footprint. And on the left, you see an overall footprint aggregating various, the most important environmental issues. So is this just interesting for statistics? No, this means that what we consume here has impacts all over the world. And here you see some examples. What we eat here or what we consume here has impacts in Indonesia, in Italy, in Brazil. And so we are in a very much interconnected world. And this is, so far, it has been neglected by policy to a large extent, at least. We try to improve our environment domestically, but we sometimes forget about the impacts we cause abroad. So the message of footprinting is also bring the demand side of the economy into on your radar. Another issue is if you look at the development of your footprints. Here you see Switzerland's greenhouse gas footprint per capita. And well, the good message, the positive message is if you look at it in the long term, and maybe depending on which time you choose, you see a slight decoupling of our greenhouse gas footprint. So we could say that's great news. Even with economic growth, it is possible to stabilize your environmental footprint. But then the question in this case is clear. It is not enough to stabilize or to reduce by 1%, because we have to know where we have to go with our footprint, where it has to be. And that's where the planetary boundaries come in. Here you see an assessment of Switzerland for various footprints. The first is here a greenhouse gas footprint, where you see how many times we are over the threshold value. And of course, as you have seen in the European study, the threshold value can be defined differently depending on what you consider as a fair share, but it won't change the big picture here. Also for ocean acidification, and if you think of us as consumers, then ocean acidification is also a subject for Swiss people. This is of course also driven by CO2, so it's not surprising that there is a large overshoot. Now, if you look at biodiversity and eutrophication, you might think the overshoot is less, but you see that it is still several times what we should have. For instance, for biodiversity is a factor of 3.7. And of course, I have to say, we call this the biodiversity footprint. It doesn't, you don't see every aspect of biodiversity. What you see here is the potential biodiversity impact due to land use. So lessons learned from these perspectives is, one is that if you take a footprint perspective, this may change your assessment to a large extent from a territorial perspective. If you look only what happens inside your borders. So that means we should act along the whole product chain. And the second message, if you assess these footprints against planetary boundaries, this leads to a fundamentally different assessment from if you just look at the development over time or if you compare to other countries. So as Tobias has shown, the European Union has the vision of living well within the limits of our planet. We have a similar, little bit more complicated version in our sustainable development strategy. But basically, it's the same vision that we should, along the entire value chain, we should respect limits of the planet. Now, how could we answer this in our national context? I think it's important to imagine what that could mean. So we should develop a vision for critical systems such as food, housing, and transportation. If I take food, a long time, our policy has focused on improving agriculture, and we had long discussions if we should intensify and thus save more land, or if we should reduce pesticides and then having less food. But maybe we should turn it around and also ask, what then should we eat? Is that amount of meat and dairy products that we consume today? Another issue is then identify the hotspots along your value chain. This can also be done through footprint analysis. So you can have much more constructive dialogues also with the company, with the business world. If you can base your assessment on where along the value chain are the real problems. And then we should also transform that into quantitative targets. This is cumbersome, but I think it's worth it. And then we should act beyond thematic and sectoral policies. What are action points? The Swiss government's environmental report outlines a few or several several levels where we can interact on the research, on business, on civil society, and the public sector. So there is not one silver bullet what we can or should do. There is not one law that we should enact or one incentive, but it's the combination of all. We should transform the visions that we have developed into acting on all levels, from science with know-how transfer also to the business. We should have more dialogue and agreements with business and finance. Also, we have to get the incentives right, the financial incentives. There is an option of information networking, and then of course also the legal framework and the public procurement. I really admire the European Union with having this farm to fork strategy. And as has been mentioned, we should really focus also on the fork and not also only on the farm, because farmers ultimately will produce what we want to eat with our fork. And that means to fight food waste, but also we should balance our diets. It does not mean that we don't have to eat any meat anymore or any cheese, but there are so many tasty plant-based products now on the market. We should try out these also. So that's my short intervention, and I would like to thank you very much, and also thank you for being invited here.
Thank you, Andreas, for bringing it somewhat down to earth, down to one country, and showing also how difficult it is, because of course we always have this link between science such as natural science, physics, so to speak, where we have clear laws and everyone can calculate them, and then it comes to such a complicated thing as society. How can we actually bring people to think about these issues? How can we actually activate change? What role can politics take? What role must politics play? Because to leave everything to the free market has not really worked out so far, if I may say such. We have great many questions already, and I would propose that I take 5 of the written questions now, with addressing them to the people which they should be addressed to, in my view, and then I would take some of the people who have raised their hands. So the first question would be from Gernot to Professor Rockström, and he asks, the planetary boundaries are mainly exceeded by growth, and whether this can be remedied, or do we have to abandon the concept of growth as such? Because how long will it work that that our ecological footprint is higher than Earth's capacity? What do you think on that?
Should I take it straight away, Jutta?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is a really important and fundamental question. And let me just start by saying that I'm personally agnostic to growth. I think we tend to fall in the trap of discussing growth, and that's the wrong discussion. Economic growth is a means to an end, and the end must always be human well-being. And there's no doubt that our current economic growth paradigm, which is driving our transgression of the boundaries, is unsustainable and unequitable. So in that sense, growth is not, let's say, in line with planetary boundaries. But I would argue that there's no economic research that suggests that we could not have good economic development within a safe operating space if we have circular business models, zero carbon economic development, and decouple in line with Andreas' evidence here. So I think we are kind of sliding in the wrong, we're falling in the wrong ditch, so to say, if we just question growth. And let me just close by saying that we also know that for the vast majority of citizens in the world, economic growth is a fundamental step towards delivering basic human needs. So we cannot exclude growth for the poor in the world.
Yes, thanks for that. And to Tobias, Christian B wants to know whether we shouldn't make maybe a quarterly report to governments concerning our progression on keeping our life within the planetary boundaries, similar to the reports we have had from science now in the corona crisis. And coupled with that, how can we make the people aware of these crises? We had the very striking example, at least here in Germany, when people saw the pictures and the videos from Bergamo, they started physical distancing without being told so. And so the question would be, would a quarterly report or maybe a weekly report or whatever towards governments help, and how could we make population aware of this crisis?
Well, there's several things you're mentioning here. One is one certainly relates to science communication or science policy communication or to the public, and there the crucial role of making sure that what we're communicating is understood and fairly easy to understand, and that's something we continuously learning about. We are this is not something we naturally would do, maybe as educated scientists. Sometimes we tend to complicate things, and there is a challenge here to create visuals that are easy to grasp and to understand, so that they're catchy. That's more on the communication side, and it's not always straightforward, especially when it comes to these difficult concepts and approaches of multifaceted phenomena. Concretely on this idea of a quarterly report of how we are doing in relation to planetary boundaries, well, that depends on a lot of factors. That depends on first and foremost, it depends on the availability of the data and the monitoring system to do so. I've been there a bit in my presentation, that we have, especially when it comes to footprinting approaches, that we have huge gaps actually. I have not explicitly pointed to that in the presentation, but Jutta, you have picked it up in your comment to it. Much of what we have been showing actually relates to data from 2012, and that's despite the fact that we rely on the best and most state-of-the-art model on such an approach that we have in Europe currently. There is no better approach available. So here we run into a big data issue actually to be able to do such an update, and underpinning that is actually the need then for making sure that we are able to generate this type of information like we do for other parameters, for other indicators. We think of GDP and all sorts of other parameters. They're available on a weekly basis, but when it comes to knowledge on at this type, we really run into a big challenge here. So it's not that straightforward.
Yes, things tend to be more complicated than one likes to think. I have a question for Andreas, I guess. Are there initiatives to link this concept of planetary boundaries with all its implications to the life cycle assessment of products and services in order to have better indicators for people to make informed decisions? Have you been working on that already?
What we try to is to link it also to the business sector, so to economic sectors. However, to specific products, it's difficult to relate it, because then you would have to make assumptions how much of this product should be consumed anyway inside the whole basket. So we make a connection to the personal consumption overall, but then very often it's more important than to choose the right products and the right quantities than the specific version, a more sustainable version of a specific product. So
well, thank you.
The short answer would be no.
Yes, I think it's complicated. I saw these calculations on that sometimes an apple from New Zealand might even be more sustainable than an apple which has been stored with very high energy input for 8 months in Europe. So it's often more complicated than one might think at first glance. There is one question which is addressed to me, I guess, from Claudia without last names, Claudia. The biosphere degradation, biodiversity loss, has its cause also in uncontrolled spreading of genetically engineered organisms and pesticide use. Why does the Green Party in Germany try to open the door for CRISPR-Cas engineered plants without having evidence of the real risks for our ecosystems? Are the Greens destroying sustainable food? Well, Claudia, to put it into perspective, I think the GMOs are actually present in one of those sectors which cannot really be quantified yet, because it's in line with chemical pollution, radioactive pollution. But of course, we need to know about the risks that are being posed by GMOs, and we are surely. It's not the Green Party that is pushing for opening the regulation. If I look at my own inbox in European Parliament, it is not the Greens that are pushing to reopen the GMO regulation. That are really other people trying to push for that. What I do think is that we need, in any case, whatever we do, we should work for an evidence approach, and we should work for the precautionary principle. And I would not make a selection here. Well, we use the precautionary principle here, but we won't use it in that field, because that's basically not what scientific evidence is about. So no, we are not destroying sustainable food. Or at least I am standing for an evidence-based approach, and I'll be very curious on what evidence actually will be presented favoring GMOs in any field, and we will surely not say we'll open the door to anything that might provide a little help in drought-ridden provinces or anything like that. I have a last question of the written questions, because we have quite a few people who raised their hands also, and this is by Bernd, and I think it should go to Professor Rockström again. Bernd says that Stefan has identified that 9 of the 15 tipping elements are already activated. So he says, isn't net zero 2050 much too late? Shouldn't we set a much more shouldn't we go for a much more recent time frame shouldn't we make a higher alert to politicians worldwide? Because when those tipping elements are already activated, then our time frame should be much shorter than 2050. Professor Rockström, what would you say on this?
Yes, thanks for this question. And this was a very important paper, which I referred to in my talk as well. And it is, I mean, clearly in the, let's say, in the uncertainty range of science, because if you want to take a full precautionary approach, the answer is yes, that we start seeing 9 of the 15 starting to move. Jutta, you made good references also to the permafrost thawing, as you rightly said. I mean, just over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of additional observations of continued rapid pace of permafrost thawing, and so you could argue for an even steeper pathway. I would say though that if you force the scientific community to answer the question, do we need to let's say change the 1.5 degrees Celsius frame due to the tipping elements analysis, I would say it is too early to say that. I think there's still scientific support for the conclusion to say that if we could decarbonize the world economy no later than 2050, we still have a reasonable chance of staying well below 2. And as things stand today, which is also that paper you referred to showing, that it's not until we go beyond 2 degrees Celsius that we seem to get more evidence of irreversibly tipping many of these tipping elements. So, you know, we often talk of not returning to Garden of Eden. I can see the point of being a bit too optimistic in that. We rather today talk of a manageable Holocene-like state, meaning that we can not get virgin planet Earth back, but we can keep it from tipping over into unmanageable state, and that is dramatic enough. And let me just close, Jutta, by sharing with you, as you may know, many of you, that the IPCC is working in the run-up to its 6th assessment, and quite recently there's been, you know, the first, let's say, final runs of the global climate models, and they indicate a much higher climate sensitivity than in the 5th assessment. The climate sensitivity is the expected mean temperature increase at a doubling of CO2. That level, as I'm sure most of you know, is has been concluded IPCC assessment after IPCC assessment to 3 degrees Celsius on average. And now many climate models show that it can be both 4 and 5 degrees Celsius. The reason for this is a much better precision. Well, the one is not entirely certain, but the indications are that it's a much better precision on cloud physics and also aerosol loading, the masking of cooling aerosols. So we may be in a situation where the challenge is, rightly, as you pointed out, even more serious than we previously thought. So I would say that today, as never before, we have more evidence than we've ever had that we need to decarbonize as fast as possible. So of course, the European Parliament, when discussing, for example, the need to reduce emissions by 65%, not by 55% by 2030, I would argue today has very strong scientific support.
Yes, thanks for this. I mean, our group is, of course, in line here, but not all political groups are happy with this proposal. Also, I was very glad that the European Parliament actually passed a resolution last November declaring a climate and ecological emergency, which was a very big achievement, actually, that we had a majority for this resolution. So, of course, we will work closely with everyone who is pushing for a stronger commitment of the European Union. And I want to bring in a good message here. We have the means. Renewable energies are as cost effective as ever. The prices are much lower than anyone would have expected even 10 years ago, not to speak of 20 years ago. I built my first photovoltaic on my roof 20 years ago, when prices were about 10 times as high as they are today. And if anyone had told me back then, in 20 years, you'll be able to harvest sun from your roof at a lower price than you can buy electricity from the grid, I would have said, well, you're crazy. Go away. This is a vision which would be very nice, but this will never happen. And it did happen. And I think we just have to unleash this potential in order to bring our emissions down very quickly. I would like to give some people the floor who have raised their hands. Now I will start with Gisela M. There are several Giselas having raised their hands, so I'm talking to Gisela M. I have unmuted you now, so you might try with your question. Gisela, go ahead. Hello? Gisela, we can't hear you. Okay, then I'll try with Gisela H, because we have another Gisela who wanted to have a question. Gisela? I heard a little sound, but then nothing else, so I'll try Delphine now. Delphine?
Yes, please. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can
go
you
ahead.
hear me?
Very well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to see all the efforts to give a positive imagination of the future. Well, I'm not so convinced that we will have a nice and possible coming together in the next 30 years, because if I take you serious, Jutta, and we add the carbon emissions, which are historically already in the atmosphere, and add it to the actual emissions of carbon, then we have the fact what the Fridays of Futures does tell us, that it is now, and that all the efforts to have nice imaginations will fail. So I am really in a great fear that we now do not prepare for the worst case, which means that the poor will practically will left behind and make their actions for that, and that the whole European political and economical groups does not understand with those kinds of academic textures you are just giving to the world, will find the awareness that they really have to change more than quick, that they have to change now, and that we, with the Corona experience, have the right way to do it. I believe, not I believe, but what I see in all the medias, that this is not happening. That, for example, the car industries, the automobile agencies, they just try to trigger out what they can do. Even the trade unions think that they, however, can survive in their old industries. So I'm sorry to all the academics you have there. I want you to get up, to make sit-ins, and to stop your normal academic way of life and proposing the future. We have to get into action. So I'm with the Fridays of Futures. Thank you.
Webinar über das Europaparlament, irgendwie über die Grenzen unseres Wachstums hier, ja. Hätte ich dir vielleicht sagen können, der Sven Giegold, der macht echt
Something very weird happened. So I was just muting several people because somehow these these were activated by themselves. I don't know. But maybe just to follow up that question, because we had also written questions on that. So maybe Sven, you might want to elaborate, because those questions were directed to you by Thomas and other people. What role do activist movements play, like Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and do we need civil disobedience in order to become quicker on policy action? What do you think, Sven?
Well, I would first of all say that although the science has developed, the basic line of the story, at least when it came to climate, has been known for a very long time. And still all the IPCC reports, which are already a quite conservative approach on climate change, they were not able to do what, at least in important parts of the world and clearly in Europe, Fridays for Future has managed to do. On the other hand, it's also interesting to see that the more radical image of Extinction Rebellion, I would say, didn't have the same credibility and not the same strength as Friday for Future. What can we learn from that? Radical gesture can be helpful, but it can also deter sympathy. So it very much depends what you do, when, and who is doing what. So it makes a big difference if people in Gorleben use civil disobedience because they believe their region is in danger, or if leftist activists do it, and then it depends how they do it. So whom you block. If you block a lignite mine, this is perhaps more understandable than blocking the transfer of commuting workers to their workplace. So it is not the method in itself, but what is clear is, I would say, peaceful means which help to bring about change is highly legitimate. And there are very different means. It starts from what a business can do to what civil society movements can do. So what I do not like is the radicalism sympathy by itself. Everything has the responsibility to reflect how to get the maximum change with legitimate democratic means. So, and this is what everybody has to ask themselves wherever you are. Perhaps I misuse my role here and ask a question to Professor Rockström, if possible. I was wondering about the state of evidence when it comes to chemical pollution. Jutta and myself, we work together on the chemical side of the debate. And of course, we know that this boundary so far seems particularly hard to quantify. But what is the state of knowledge in this regard? I also, as politicians, we are often exposed to people who believe that the degree of chemical pollution is already a strong health hazard. At the same time, evidence seems to be much less strong, and for many factors which cause a lot of citizens' questions, like large degrees of allergies and the like, which are hard to explain by one factor, this creates a lot of questions. So therefore, I'm interested, where do you stand when it comes to the quantification of this boundary of chemical pollution?
Yes, thanks for this, Sven. So as I referred to very rapidly in my talk, I mentioned the Planetary Boundary 3.0, and we are in the midst of preparing the next update on the Planetary Boundary science. which will focus, by the way, apart from updating all the numbers, also to run for the first time a series of Earth system models to look at interactions between boundaries. But right as we speak, actually earlier today was the 4th session in a series of novel entities workshops, so the chemical pollutions workshop. So we've gathered a whole community, a group of scientists in the chemicals sphere to try and publish a paper and provide inputs to the quantification of a chemicals boundary. And the challenge is to cluster chemicals in different clusters of functions connected not only to human but also to Earth system functioning, and then try as far as possible to incorporate the cocktail effect between different types of chemical clusters. And that is what's so complex here. But this is ongoing, and the signals I get back is that it's advancing in a very constructive way. So I foresee that in the next, we're aiming to have this submitted by the end of this year. So I foresee that something will be coming out quite soon.
Yeah, thank you. The only thing I learned from your response beyond the good news that there will be something coming, that of course on the health side, we will need another approach in order to look at quantifying the magnitude of the problem, because obviously you are looking at planetary boundaries.
Yeah. I think this is quite important, just to make that clear, that the planetary boundary framework does under no circumstance replace many of the environmental and health regulations we have focusing on human individual health. So the critical loads for chemicals for individuals is a threshold or boundary setting that is absolutely fundamental for human health. But what we're interested in is, when does it aggregate to a point where it threatens the functioning of the Earth system? And of course, you can see for chemicals that let's say the unacceptable levels of toxicity for humans come much earlier than the threat potentially of the stability of the Earth system. And we're kind of, these are coming from two different sides towards the same point, perhaps in the end, but the kind of entry point of analysis is different, and I think it complements each other.
Yeah. Yes, and to add here, did I get this right, that novel entities also comprise plastics and GMOs and radioactive elements?
Correct. Yes.
Yes. Okay. I would like to give someone the floor from the long list of people having raised their hand, and I will try with Frank W. Whoops, what happened now? Oh, somehow I'm not very good with this very small window, trying to get people here. Maybe he put down his hand. No, there he is. Frank, and the last name starts with a W, but I cannot unmute him. That's so maybe someone from the technical staff in the background could try to unmute Frank. He unmuted him. He muted himself. That's at least what the sign says to me.
Jutta, the problem is known. It happens with some new users. So just choose.
Then we'll try Severin. No.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great. Go ahead.
Wonderful. So I would have a question to Professor Rockström and to Sven Giegold. It's my question would be, which industry? So when I look at the planetary boundary concept, my impression is that the industry with the highest impact is the food industry. So starting with the agriculture and the whole chain upward. So my first question would be, is this correct? And is here the highest impact possible on all planetary boundaries? And then my question to Mr. Giegold would be, my impression is that the concept of Professor Rockström is not so difficult to understand. But one has the impression that in the politics, somehow it's not understood. So as you are in politics, can you tell me why?
Okay.
Yeah, I can start by by confirming that yes, the food system is today assessed as being the single largest cause behind the transgression of planetary boundaries. That comes across as a surprise to many, but when you think of it, food is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases today in kind of economic sector terms. It's by far the largest consumer of fresh water. Roughly 70% of the withdrawals of blue water is consumed for irrigation primarily. It's by far the #1 cause behind biodiversity loss, and it's by far the cause behind land use expansion, and it's basically the driver of the eutrophication due to overuse of phosphorus and nitrogen. So you get it right on food, you stand a good chance of transforming back into safe operating space. It's of course not the only sector. We need to decarbonize all sectors in terms of energy use, but it's interesting that food holds large parts of the integrated agenda in its hands, and it's, as you rightly pointed out, the entire value chain. It's not only the farmer, but it's right through the whole processing, all the way up to the point of dietary patterns and food waste. So it's a big agenda with a lot of opportunity.
Sven, you wanted to say something on people not believing in science?
Well, thank you, but I personally believe that behind what you were asking is the belief that politicians or politics is simply a function of knowledge. I would doubt this, and I would also say that this is only partly democratic. So what I want to say is, I think at least in Europe, the core of the problem is not a lack of knowledge. So the key decision makers in business, in politics, they know about climate change, they know time is running, they know how dangerous we are. But they are elected every 4 or 5 years by people for whom not necessarily the planet is the most important question. And therefore, and also for them, it is not always a question of knowledge. It is also a question of their preference order. So I think it is very important for any environmental agenda to be also credible when it comes to economics and to the social question. We will never be able to win majorities if we cannot convince at the same time that a transformative agenda will not ruin the economy and will not lead to even more inequality. And this is something which is really fundamental. So if we want majorities in the parliaments, we need an agenda which reconciles economic reason, social justice, and the planetary boundaries. And in order to get there, we need also some learning. In civil society, for instance, a certain maximalism which scares people of potential social and economic consequences is not the most intelligent and not the most achieving strategy. On the other hand, a strategy which believes business will do it themselves and so on is totally naive. And so one can go on, but I think it's very important not to believe it's all a question of knowledge. It's a question of strategy and getting the messages right, at least when we talk about Europe. And but I believe you can see that even in Corona crisis, the number of people who want to vote green remains quite high, to the surprise of many. And this is, I think, because I believe a lot of people know how dangerous the situation currently is, ecologically.
Yes, thank you, Sven. That was very comprehensive. And I have Barbara who raised her hand. I'll try to unmute you. Yes, should work.
Können Sie mich hören? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Please be brief because we have only 5 minutes left, and I would
right.
like to have.
I follow Sven Giegold's talk. I think we need, underneath all the measures we take, we need a fundamental reorientation in terms of life philosophy, how we regard life and lifestyles. And we have to get away from the me ideology and work for the common good. We need to really change our outlook on life and lifestyles. We need a new morality or ethics. Thank you.
Thank you. I think as time is flying by, I just had a look at it and was a little bit, panicked, because of course everyone should have a say at the end of this very high level webinar, and thank you again for sparing so much time for us. It was really a highlight in all the webinars which we've done so far. I'm sure Sven will agree, although Sven always has very interesting guests. So I would like to reverse the order, start with Andreas, then Tobias, then Professor Rockström, and Sven, you may have the final word. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for this discussion. And I was touched by the word of Delphine raising the urgency. And on one hand, I agree with her, and I'm so thankful, so grateful to the Fridays for Future. But I think we don't need only Fridays for Future, but also Thursday evenings for future, Mondays for future, and Tuesdays for future. What I want to say with that, whatever you are, if you are a scientist, if you are a politician, a businesswoman, a worker, whatever, there's a level where you can act on and where you can change things, and I think we have to be optimistic that it is possible to achieve this transformation. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also like to pick up on this transformative agenda, and I couldn't agree more with Sven that we need to reconcile economic considerations with ecological considerations and social considerations in order to achieve this and to succeed. We've recently published our newest State of the Environment report, which is the 5-year flagship report of the agency that we produce, as I said, every 5 years. And in that report, one of the key conclusions we draw is actually that we face unprecedented and urgent challenges, and that is a conclusion drawn from this type of analysis that we've been discussing today. But then further on, concluding that the needed transformative agenda will only succeed if we are able to bring people on board, if we are able to rethink the economy, and if we are able to rethink the roles of the different actors in this pathway. The role of government, the role of institutions, the role of governance more broadly, in order to phase out what should be phased out and upscale what needs to be upscaled to basically, be able to don't miss the boat on our way, because as the Planetary Boundaries framework clearly concludes, there are tipping points, and we are at the edge of irreversibilities, as Johan has pointed out. So if we don't act now, at some point it might be too late. So I encourage you to look at these overall conclusions that we draw from the report, of which some I've just mentioned, which sums up very nicely sort of the key findings that we draw an analysis from all across Europe on the leverage points that we actually have to achieve a transformation of Europe towards sustainability.
Yeah, thanks, Jutta, and thanks, Sven, for organizing this. I think it's a manifestation of a special moment in time. I mean, it is easy to despair, and it's absolutely true that we're not transforming yet. But I think it's also fair to say that in the midst of an unprecedented global health crisis, we are able to speak about sustainable, resilient recovery. And I think that shows a level of mainstreaming and maturity in the whole sustainability agenda. It would not have been possible just 5 years ago. We would have been accused of saying, why are you taking benefit of this disaster to speak about environmental protection? Oh no, today it is absolutely central to speak about the connections between health and sustainability for human well-being. And I think we are at this pivotal point with the new narrative of how sustainability is changing face from the old story of sacrifice to the new story of opportunity and equity. And I think that is real. And it's we're not there yet, but as Winston Churchill said, and I think we need to abide to that rule, never waste, never make a big crisis wasted. And this is the moment to really have this dialogue and put transformative thinking into operational management and initiative. And I think the European Union is showing some steps in that direction, and therefore I'm really grateful that we are able to place the Planetary Boundaries at the center stage of a real concrete discussion of our future.
Yes, I would allow myself a few political remarks at the end. I agree with Johan Rockström that things have changed and mainstream. 10 years ago, we had the same debate with the Green New Deal, with the proposals from the United Nations Environmental Programme, the Greens, many others, asking to use the financial crisis and the public investment needed in order to get to green transformation. But at that time, we couldn't win it. The debate, the power was not strong enough. There was no Friday for Future. The figures were not as bad as they were now, but now we will win that a significant part, at least in Europe and in some other parts of the world, of the spending to get out of the corona mess will be directed into environmental change. That is really different, and it's a sign of hope. But I also would like to say the following. I see a confusing tendency to think that you can invest simply out of environmental problems. I do not believe this. A priori, if you spend money, you are producing more CO2, you are stretching planetary boundaries. It is not enough to maximize green investment. You need also to work on prices, regulation, and limits. Limits are absolutely crucial. Limits for pollution, limits for emissions, limits for the use of natural habitats, and so on. And I believe it's very important that we also honestly tell that, yes, public investment for the right things, private investment for the right thing is important. But in the end, what matters is whether we act in the environmental limits or not. And this is not simply to be achieved by investment. Investment is only a means to get there, as, by the way, I agree with Professor Rockström on how to discuss on growth, but it is not sufficient by itself. And when it comes to the key two issues on European environmental politics, I think there are two things. First, the climate agenda was planned to be the key priority of the German presidency. Now there's the danger that the climate agenda will be pushed into the second row, and there will be not a deal on the climate law during the German presidency. I think that is not acceptable. We want that climate is a top priority for the German presidency, and that there is a deal on the climate law until the end of the year. And second, when it comes to agriculture, there is, of course, a strong danger that we have a nice discussion on farm to fork, but the common agricultural policy and the spending that goes with it will be more or less untouched. And as Greens, it is very clear we want the farm to fork strategy, we want it strong, but at the same time we have to do the maximum we can in order to reform the common agricultural policy, because this is the biggest lever in order to get our hand on the food system, which was also here discussed as being so crucial. If the public spends such a lot of money for one sector, we can demand that there are positive social and environmental outcomes.
Yes, and to conclude on that, Sven, you probably saw the report by the European Court of Auditors, who basically said, well, what is going on in the common agricultural policy is a sheer waste of money when it comes to the preservation of biodiversity. They are the so-called greening measures, but they don't have any effect of all. And the auditors found that the best impact is actually agroecology, so organic farming, but even more that the money which is given to farmers for the preservation of biodiversity, for example, when they are preserving certain habitats which have, of course, to be managed, because else there will be forests everywhere. So this has the best effect on biodiversity, and we should take this as a lesson for the shaping of the new common agricultural policy. Let me thank again all our referents. It was really a very high-level webinar. Thanks to all the participants and listeners. I'm very sorry that we could not take on board all the questions. Please, if any question of yours was not answered, feel free to send us a mail. We'll try our best to answer all questions. And thanks again for being with us. And please spread the word how important it is that we change not only our economy, not only our politics, but also our personal habits, our personal behavior. And the most important thing, in my view, is spread the word. Spread the word about the urgency. We don't have time to argue for another 20 years. Thanks to everyone. Have a very nice evening. And maybe we'll see each other in not a virtual space. And very last point, thanks to our team in the background who made this possible technically. You're great. Thanks so much for for suffering so much with these webinars where you have to sacrifice your evenings. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.